And for more, we'll speak now to Amy Austin Holmes. She's Associate Professor of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. Professor Holmes, thank you very much for joining us on the show. I want to start by asking you about reports, saying that Giuliani has named his new cabinet, not clear whether or not it's interim or permanent, but that the team consists mainly of members who are linked to jihadists and extremist groups. Now, if this is true, and I stress this is not fully confirmed yet, how concerned should we be that Syria's minority groups are not part of this rebuilding effort?
Thank you very much for having me and for covering what's happening in Syria. These are truly historic events and that will have ramifications not just for Syria, but for the wider Middle East, and I would argue globally. I mean, this is the fall of a family dynasty after 50 years in power is quite a remarkable event. Of course, Bashar al-Assad took power after his father, Hafez al-Assad. And so really, Syria now, for the first time in more than 50 years, is grappling with creating a new government. And this transitional period, which only started a few days ago, is, it's still really too early to say how this will play out. Of course, the statement, as you showed, said that they plan for this transitional period to last until March of next year, 2025. And you're right that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, one of the rebel groups that essentially led this blitz against the Assad regime, does have links to al-Qaeda. They were an al-Qaeda offshoot. The leader, Giuliani, has gone on a charm offensive, if you will, for a number of years already, saying and trying to distance himself from his past. And it's an open question to what extent he's actually done that. And so that's what I think everyone is now waiting to see, whether, this moderation that he says he's undergone, whether that actually is true in reality.
And Professor, we know that the U.S., well, at least the Biden administration, is saying that it will support new Syrian leaders who protect women and renounce terrorism, but hasn't actually named who exactly. HTS not specifically named either. Do we know if Washington has a preference at this time for who might take power?
Well, the statement that you're referencing did make clear that the United States would be willing to work with the future government after this, this transitional government and moving forward, if they fulfill certain very basic and fundamental criteria of respecting human rights and having, creating a new government that is inclusive of all of Syrian society. Syria is an incredibly diverse country. You have many minorities that live in Syria. The fact that it's referred to, the army of Bashar al-Assad has been referred to and officially as the Syrian Arab Army. That was always a misnomer, because you had many non-Arabs living in Syria. You have Kurds, you have Christians, you have Assyrians, Syriac Christians, Armenians, the Alawite minority, Syrian Turkmen, Yazidis. So it's truly a diverse country. And this diversity needs to be represented going forward, and, along with sort of basic protections for human rights. And so there was a statement put out by the HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a few days ago regarding specifically Syrian Kurds, because the Kurdish language in the past actually has been banned in Syria. And now in the northeast, where you have this Kurdish semi-autonomous region led by Syrian Kurds called the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria, they've taken advantage of, for the past more than a decade now, and created kind of a semi-autonomous local government in the northeast with to a large extent autonomy from the regime in Damascus before Assad fell. And they've begun using the Kurdish language in their in their daily life, and also in some of their official announcements, along with Arabic and also the language of the Christian minority, which is Aramaic. And so I'm just saying this as background to how this region has evolved, and so the reality has already changed, actually, for a number of years, where 40% of the country was living in non-regime held areas, the northeast that I just mentioned, and also Idlib, where Jolani is from, HTS. And so they already have experience for many years of living essentially semi-independently or autonomously of the regime in Damascus under Assad. But forming a new government for the whole country and bringing together these diverse factions, it will be a very major undertaking, and that's what we're waiting to see how that plays out.
Sure. Certainly a new reality in Syria, Professor, and it will take a lot of time and money to rebuild the country. So how critical are the ongoing sanctions in shaping Syria's reconstruction? And do you think the international community is ready to lift or adjust them?
That's an excellent question. I don't think there's been any decision made on that yet. Again, this has just happened 2 days ago, essentially, that we've seen this regime topple. So the sanctions that were in place were targeting the Assad regime and the supporters of the Assad regime. But already a couple of years ago, the United States Treasury announced what they call General License 22, which allowed investment in the non-regime held parts of Syria. So those parts in the northeast and northwest that I mentioned, approximately 40% of the country that were not controlled by Assad. Because the US government and Treasury recognize that the needs of the Syrian people are greater than what the donor community was able to provide, especially with the crises in Ukraine and Israel, Gaza, etc. And so to allow private investment in these non-regime held parts of Syria was necessary. And so that has already been, those sanctions effectively were lifted on the non-regime held parts of Syria already a few years ago through this General License 22. Now, the question will be, how this will, whether this will be expanded for all of Syria. But I think, again, we're waiting to see what happens with the transitional government.
Understood, Professor. I want to ask you about how big a complication Israel might be. We know it's reoccupied the Golan Heights, hit over 500 targets, claims to have destroyed the Syrian naval fleet as well. I mean, tactically, it's fairly easy to understand, but is there a strategy to all of this? Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, saying he wants to change the face of the Middle East. What does that mean?
Well, this uprising and the topple of the Assad regime happened, if we look back kind of at a larger geopolitical context, right? I mean, Israel had effectively decapitated Hezbollah, right? And so Iran, this major Iranian proxy group in Israel, Hezbollah, had been weakened because Hezbollah, of course, was supporting Hamas after October 7. And so Israel saw, rightly so, Hezbollah as a threat to Israel and was carrying out strikes to essentially eliminated the leadership of Hezbollah. So Iran was already weakened in Syria. Russia was also weakened because it had prioritized the conflict in Ukraine. And so the two main backers of Assad, Russia and Iran, were weakened, which is what essentially created the situation where now these non-state actors, the rebel groups, could take advantage of and move to and march on Damascus. Israel does have, I think, understandably reasons to be concerned because threats have emanated from Syria in the past to Israel. However, and they don't want, they're concerned also about the HTS links to Al-Qaeda and are not sure whether they will renounce those and how they will behave moving forward. And so they've taken these strikes against the existing military facilities in Syria to avoid them, to prevent that from falling into the hands of some of these groups. And so that's what we're seeing playing out now. But, the other question is that we have also Turkish proxies in the north of Syria that have also increased some of the territory that they control. And so it's really from both the north and the south of Syria that you have, Turkey in the north and Israel in the south that are now taking advantage of the situation and expanding the area that they control in Syria.
Right. Okay, Professor Holmes, we do have to leave it there. Very grateful for your time and for your thoughts this morning. Amy Austin Holmes is Associate Professor of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University.